Right, hello there. This is A-Level Psychology, AQA, and this is the social influence topic. And this is going to be the first of two videos that looks at minority influence. And in this video, we're going to look at research about it, and in the next video, we'll look at explanations. So first of all, what do we mean by minority influence? Well, if you think back to our studies on conformity, as you remember, conformity is where you have a majority in the group, a larger group, and then one or maybe two people who are going to change their opinion to fit with the group. That's called majority influence. We've talked about it in terms of conformity, but majority influence is just a different name for it, because in conformity you've got a group that's the majority and they're influencing the minority. Minority influence is basically the other way around. So when you've got a group like that, where you've got one or two people who think something different and then the majority that all think the same thing, minority influence is when one or two people can influence the rest to change their minds. So here you go. Here's the formal definition. So those who are in the minority in a group persuade the large group of people in the majority to change their views. So it's kind of, if you want a good example of it, I guess it's the jury situation. So imagine you're having a murder trial. You've got 12 members of the jury. 10 of them think he's guilty. 2 of them think he's innocent. And it's looking at, can those two people persuade the rest of the group to change their mind? So that's the example that I like to keep in my head for this one. And the way that this happens, the way that they change their views, the majority, is through what we call internalization. Now, if you can remember what that means, that's good. What it does mean is that you have both public and private opinions are changing, and it's permanent. If you think about it, you couldn't really have either of the other types of of social influence happening here. You couldn't have compliance, because it just doesn't work when it's the other way around. You're not going to fit with the minority to not look stupid. It's just the wrong way around. It doesn't work. So when you've got someone who's in the majority deciding, oh no, I'm going to agree with these two people who are in the minority, they're only going to do that because they really agree with what they're saying. They properly agree both publicly and privately. It's almost like the private opinion changes first and then they kind of go public, because it's got a cost to it. You're joining the unpopular group that's in the minority. So your private opinion changes first. That's a permanent change, and it's a public opinion change as well. So it's internalization. So that's how it happens. Right, so let's look first of all at this study by Moscovici. This is like our key study basically for the area of minority influence, and you need to know all about it and know it really well. So this is what happened in Moscovici's study. I'll give you some details in a second, but he showed people slides like this. Now hopefully as you look at these, you're thinking that they're all blue. They're supposed to, I'm giving you a few different colours here, but they're supposed to all be fairly unambiguously, clearly blue coloured, but different shades of blue. Now, what Moscovici was trying to do was to see if he could use a minority in his experiment to start getting people in the majority to say that the slides were green. So here's how he did it. It's kind of like a reverse Ash experiment. If you think about Ash, where he had the group of the majority and they all gave the wrong answer, and the person in the minority, you wanted to see if they fit with them or not. What he's doing in this experiment is planting the minority. They're the Confederates, and they're in some experiments they're going to give the wrong answer, and we'll talk about in a sec how that worked a bit more. So have a look then. So think about Ash flipped on its head. You'll want to see whether the majority will change or not, people in the majority. Right. So what we've got is 4 participants and 2 Confederates in each group. And they're shown a series of blue slides, like I just showed you, clearly meant to be clearly blue slides, and not ones that are kind of in between, that some people would say green and some say blue. They're meant to be clearly blue slides. And what they have to do is they have to judge the colour of them. And then there's 3 conditions. There's first of all what we call the consistent condition. And this is where your 2 Confederates, who are the minority, they always call the slide green. So they're being what we call consistent. And then there's another experimental condition, which is the inconsistent condition. And in 2/3 of the trials, they call it green, and in the others, they call it blue. So what they want to see is, does that make a difference to whether people will copy them, whether people will go over to their point of view, whether they're consistent or inconsistent. And then in the control condition, everyone was a participant and they just said what colour they thought. So there were no Confederates at all. So there we are, 3 conditions, and they're judging the colour of these slides. And then what they found is this. In the consistent group, the minority influenced the participants on 8% of the trials. In the inconsistent, that fell to 1.3, and in the control, basically nothing. So you can see that they've kept that control condition so that if what they want to know is, do people without the Confederates there always judge it as blue? And you can see that there's a very, very, very few cases that haven't. But remember, there were no Confederates at all in that control condition, and they just had to say what colour the slide was. So what's happened in that condition is that everyone is saying blue, 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 blue every time, apart from like maybe one person or something. 0.25% of responses weren't blue. So let's look at these consistent and inconsistent responses. You can see there's quite a difference, and maybe this graph makes it look bigger than it is. If you think back to Ash's results, he found, if you remember, 36.8% of responses conformed. So you can see, actually, like, yes, it's the consistent minority is getting a bigger result, isn't it, than the inconsistent minority. This 8% refers to the number of responses that conformed or not conformed, that were influenced by the minority. So they would have said green. So in 8% of the trials in the consistent condition, participants gave a response that fitted with the minority. And then in the inconsistent, you can see that's fallen to 1.3%. So you can see the consistent minority had far more of an effect than the inconsistent minority, but neither of them are big, are they, if you think about the numbers overall? So conclusions then. First of all, that consistency in a minority can have an effect on the majority, that it's more effective than being inconsistent. Remember, the inconsistent minority were the ones that said blue sometimes and green sometimes. And the second conclusion is that minorities just aren't very effective. They're not very influential, however they do it. This is the third conclusion. Sorry, inconsistent minorities don't really have an influence. If you think about 1% influence, that's basically nothing, isn't it? So although it was more than the control, it wasn't much more than the control. So we're saying that consistency here is important. However, it's not very effective. Right, let's look at some evaluation then. So that was your study, and you need to make sure you've made some really good notes on that you really clearly can explain it and understand how it works. Evaluation then. First problem, mundane realism. If you think about, and this is a term again that we're just getting used to, isn't it? So I've given you the definition here. Mundane realism is the degree to which the materials and procedures in experiments are similar to events that occur in the real world. Now, I'd like you to think back to the last time when you had to sit down and judge the colour of a slide. You might have to think quite hard, because it doesn't really happen in everyday life, does it? If you can think of a time when you had to judge the colour of a slide, well done. But it doesn't really chime with most of our experience in terms of when we're being asked to of real life events where we're trying to make decisions with other people. Then we've got ecological validity is the second problem, and that's where you can we want to question, can we I mean, it's sort of the same thing. People are being brought into the lab. They're doing this task that really lacks mundane realism. Can we really generalise their behaviour from this lab setting where they're doing this artificial task? Are they going to show the same behaviour in a real life setting? And you could really question that, couldn't you? Third problem is that actually, no, this one's a strength. Having said that ecological validity could be a problem, actually, when you're in a jury, you do sit around a table and debate facts like this and try to come to a decision. So you could argue that it kind of is similar to that real life task. And then what we have also to think about here is a study by Nemeth and Brillmeyer. And they actually ran a mock jury task. And the details of this are in your booklet. You can go and have a read of it. But basically, they contradicted the result of Moscovici, because what they found was that actually when people were consistent, it didn't have that much of an effect. But when they found that people were flexible, that had much more of an effect than them being consistent. So if they could, for example, take on a couple of arguments, kind of admit, I agree with this point that you're making, but I still think that he's innocent, then that was more important and had more of an effect. So it found that actually being flexible was more important than being consistent. So that contradicts Moscovici's finding. And then the last thing to say is that actually this was a task using all female participants for a change, not male ones. But yeah, so again, we could say it's lacking population validity because it's using all female participants. We can't necessarily then say that you can generalize the results to males and say that males will conform to minority influence in the same way. So there we have it, Moscovici's experiment.